Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Leeds. I'm a recently retired bariatric physician and I chair the European Industry Group, TDMR Europe, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar. Now we're just going to pause for just a few moments while we wait for some others to join us. The numbers are going up quite rapidly, as they tend to just after the deadline time. While we're waiting for them all to arrive, let me just tell you that TDMR Europe is a trade body for manufacturers and distributors that produce formula products, and part of our purpose is to provide educational materials for healthcare professionals and others, and also to interact with those in national and European legislatures to ensure that the legislation relating to these products is a fair and on a level playing field. I'm just looking at the numbers again now. We still have a little way to go because 260 or so people have registered. Just give a few more moments to allow some more people to arrive. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar, Proven Facts and Popular Myths Relating to the Use of Total Diet Replacement Products. We're in an area of point of time where effective ways of managing people who have overweight and obesity are really very important, and we have a rising number of people globally who have diabetes and pre-diabetes, and we need to have some very effective, cost-effective and safe ways of intervening. And so we need to consider the evidence relating to this type of intervention, and also some of the problems that relate to what people think about this, and that's what we're going to do today. We now have 97 participants, 98, just coming up to 100, so I think it's appropriate to start, so we won't delay anymore. We move on to the next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping points, question and answers. If you would please type these into the Q&A option at the bottom of the page. We will obviously not necessarily be able to address all of those, but we'll do our best. Most of these may well come up in the Q&A section at the end, but if time allows, we'll take some of them at the end of each presentation. If you would like to receive copies of the presentations or more information, then please get in touch with the Secretariat. And also, if you have any technical problems during the course of the event, please email the Secretariat and they'll try to sort that out for you. Next slide, please. And so our program for this afternoon, I'm very briefly going to look at the latest evidence in relation to the large clinical trials. After that, George Tham from the University of Glasgow is going to look at some of the issues that relate to weight loss maintenance. And then Kelly Johnson and Mark Gilbert will discuss some of the issues relating to the evidence in relation to some of the myths relating to total diet replacement. May we move on to the next slide, please? So we are going to move on. These are our speakers. I'll introduce each one again before each presentation, but I'm now going to run very quickly through the evidence relating to recent clinical trials. And I'm just waiting for this to be activated. Yes, there we are. Good. Okay. My background then is as a recently retired NHS bariatric physician, but I also now, my academic base, my main base is at the Parker Institute in Frederiksberg Hospital in Copenhagen. And you may be wondering why I'm sitting in the middle of a public park. I decided that it would be better to look at Rosenborg Palace Gardens in Copenhagen rather than my somewhat untidy office. Those of you who've ever seen any of my offices in my various places of work will know how untidy they can become. I'm going now to look at the evidence in relation to some of these recent trials. My disclosures: I work for Cambridge Weight Plan as the medical director until March 2019, and I now chair the European Industry Group. I'm going to start with a slide that I've made to mark the centenary of the effective extraction and purification of insulin, which of course was a program of work that started in May 1921 in Toronto, which eventually led to an effective extraction in early 1922 and an effective use of insulin. But I've chosen this slide just to draw attention to the fact that prior to that, the diet for those who developed diabetes, in most cases we presume type 2 diabetes, was a very energy restricted diet, and in some cases with fast days. It was a high protein, high fat, very low carbohydrate diet. And it's interesting to consider that when we think about what is happening now, which is that Oops, it's run on a little bit. Let's get back to the right place. There's a slight delay between pressing the button and its appearance. So what is interesting now, of course, is that there's a renewed interest in low carbohydrate diets. There's interest in ketogenic diets. And of course, total diet replacements are in fact low energy, low carbohydrate diets. So I'm going to begin today by looking at definitions. Then I'm going to summarize the direct diabetes remission trial, the DIADEM trial, and the preview diabetes prevention trial. So we need to consider some definitions first of all. Total diet replacement means the total replacement of conventional food with formula products. These were designed 40 to 50 years ago in order to provide all the micronutrients required on a daily basis while reducing energy to a much lower level. By definition, low energy liquid diets are over 100 calories. Often in most of the clinical trials, we're using 800 to 1,000 calories per day. Very low energy diets are those which are under 800 calories. And remember that at the very beginning of this 40 to 50 year experimental program of work, the diets were much lower in energy, sometimes down as low as 300 or 450 calories per day. They are, as I've already said, low carbohydrate, but they're not very low carbohydrate. So they're under the 130 gram per day threshold that defines low carbohydrate, but they're not as low as the 20 or 30 grams per day for the very low carbohydrate diets. Protein content is about 60 to 80 grams for a 600 to 800 calorie diet, and the fat content works out as about 20% of energy. So the consequence of using this type of diet, of course, provided the individual is compliant and doesn't eat any other supplementary food, is that there's an energy deficit of about 1,000 to 2,000 calories per day, which contrasts with the usual diet that is used in dietetic practice of a 600 calorie deficit per day. The consequence of that is that there is greater weight loss, usually in the range around about 1.3 kilograms for women and perhaps a little higher for men of 1.5 kilograms per week. Contrary to expectations among many healthcare professionals, the compliance with this type of diet is actually very good. Once an individual has been on it for a few days, they very often will comply. And it's interesting to ask, why is that so? In my own clinical experience, I find that people feel different very quickly. Our work in Copenhagen, of course, is focused on people with osteoarthritis. And we find that in many individuals, the pain goes away very quickly, sleep improves, and people become very compliant and stay on the diet for as long as is necessary if they appreciate some benefit. But there's also a question of appetite suppression. There's a little bit of evidence suggesting that the raised ketones in the blood suppress the otherwise raised ghrelin that would occur on energy restriction. Little evidence for that. George Tham is going to talk in a moment about the whole issue of what happens in the maintenance period. So I'm going to begin by summarizing the direct diabetes remission clinical trial, which has been taking place and is still taking place in Newcastle in northern England and in Glasgow in southern Scotland. It's a cluster randomized trial, meaning that the randomization is on the basis of practices, and there were 30 of those in Scotland and northeast England. The importance of this is that this was a trial undertaken in primary care so that it could be translated directly into practice rather than require an intermediate stage of yet another trial before action could be taken. The comparison was between usual care and an 810 calorie per day total diet replacement. This was delivered by healthcare professionals. It was the practice nurses and in some cases the dietitians, but always supervised by dietitians who were using the Counterweight Plus program, a program developed at Robert Gordon's Institute originally, and which is quite widely used now in Scotland. All of these patients had received a diagnosis of diabetes within 6 years. None of them were insulin treated. They were either diet or diet and oral agents. Quite a wide body mass index range you see there. Observations were made at 1 and 2 years. I'm going to refer to those now, but the 5-year measurements are being made throughout 2021, and we expect a preliminary report in December this year or in early next year. The primary endpoints were weight loss of more than 15 kilograms at 1 year or remission of diabetes at 1 year. And you see the results here, the basic results in the TDR treated group. And by the way, the individuals used that diet for 12 to 20 weeks. Now, many of you would think, gosh, that's extraordinary that people can actually follow the diet for so long. But the reality is that they can do this and seem to be very happy to do so. It's the transfer across to conventional food and then maintenance, which is the point at which there are additional challenges. But as you see there, the weight loss of 15 kilograms was achieved by 24% in the TDR group and none of them in the NHS group. Now, that does not, of course, mean that the others didn't achieve good weight losses. You'll see in a moment that there was a distribution as you'd expect. If you look at remission of diabetes, 46% were in remission at 1 year in the usual care group, a small number. And what this illustrates is that, in fact, while it is possible for people to achieve sufficient weight loss to go into remission with conventional diet, and there's good recent meta-analysis of this, to actually get a large proportion of individuals to achieve diabetes remission, you need a really effective way to achieve enough weight loss in enough people. This figure illustrates the relationship between the amount of weight loss and the proportion in remission. The scale, the vertical scale, is proportion in remission at 12 months, 0 to 100%, and the scale along the bottom divides individuals according to amount of weight loss: 0, less than 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and more than 15. And if you pool those who'd achieved at least a 10 kilogram weight loss, then 73% of those individuals were in remission at 1 year. The other effects of this, and of course there's much more detail to this than I'm describing now, was that there was a great reduction of anti-diabetes medications. That, of course, was one of the criteria for moving into remission. But taking the group as a whole, including those who did not actually go into remission, 78% reduction of use of anti-diabetes medications, 68% reduction of high blood pressure medications, reminding us again that this type of intervention does usually deliver quite an appreciable reduction of blood pressure, 6, 8, sometimes 10 millimeters of mercury within a week or so, and that these blood pressure reductions are in fact sustained, provided weight reduction is sustained. There was also a quality of life improvement according to the EQ5 questionnaire. At 2 years, the results are good, but there's a little bit of drift backwards. Remission at 2 years, 36% were in remission overall. For those who actually managed to maintain 10 kilograms at 2 years, it was 63% compared to 73% at 1 year. So those results are remarkably good. And of course, we're all looking forward to find out what has happened at 5 years when that is reported at the end of this year. Now, lots of subsidiary studies have been done, and I can only really focus on just one that I selected, which is that in the Newcastle subgroup, Roy Taylor and his colleagues, working with the Glasgow team, which was led by Mike Lean, undertook scanning of the liver and pancreas, MRI scanning of liver and pancreas, and worked out the change in volume and change in fat. And I've picked out just one figure there, what you see on the left. If you look in the upper panels, it's the very high liver fat content at the beginning of the diet, and then the dramatic reduction of liver fat, which occurs as a result of following this type of diet for 12 to 20 weeks. They defined those who'd gone into remission as responders and those who'd not gone into remission as non-responders, and established that one variable that influenced whether or not people went into remission was the duration of since the diagnosis. The shorter duration gave more responders, and that also maintenance of remission was associated with more effective weight maintenance and more effective maintenance of liver fat reduction. So we're beginning to get an idea about mechanisms, and there are other papers. Very recently, there was one, for example, on pancreatic fat content and also on pancreatic morphology, which is, after 2 years, quite dramatically improved. So I can summarize that by saying that the direct program delivers sustained remissions at 24 months for more than a third of people with type 2 diabetes. But we also know that that sustained remission is linked to the extent of the sustained weight loss. So we know where we are now with that. Now this continues, but it is already being rolled out into Scotland, and NHS England has a program of rolling this out, which is ongoing at this very moment in 5,000 people, with a view eventually to making this type of intervention available to cause remission in some individuals with early diabetes. I'm also pleased to tell you that there is a diabetes remission center at the Abu Dhabi Diabetes Center as well. So this is being taken up now in other countries. And so it's important, therefore, to refer to the fact that, of course, that study was largely on people of European origin. Shahid Tahiri has recently published a report from Qatar, where he studied 147 people who were men and women from the Middle East and North Africa, and demonstrated that exactly the same findings could be achieved in that population group. Again, this was a primary care intervention, an 800 calorie diet, total diet replacement for the first 12 weeks, then food reintroduction. And you see the weight losses there, 12 kilograms in the intervention group at 1 year and 4 kilograms in the usual care group, remission 61% compared to 12%. And also, of course, the expected changes in use of medications. So we can now say that this is not just something that is applicable to Europeans, but is also applicable to other populations as well. And that is, of course, very important. The third slide that the third trial that I would wish to draw your attention to is one that was funded by research funding from the European Union, and a study undertaken in 6 countries within Europe and also in Australia and New Zealand. And it was a study on people with prediabetes, 2,224 individuals with prediabetes and who were overweight. Started a 3-year diabetes prevention program, but they began it with 8 weeks of total diet replacement, 800 calories per day. And importantly, 91% completed the dietary program. On average, they lost 10.7 kilograms. There were 2/3 of these people were in fact women, and their average weight loss was about 10.3 kilograms. The weight loss in men on average was just over 11 kilograms. And for those who achieved the target weight loss of 8%, they could go on into the maintenance program, but also nearly two-thirds of them had already moved to being non-diabetic. They were not pre-diabetic. So that was good up to that point. And then the 3-year weight maintenance program drew on the findings of the Diogenes trial that had been reported from Copenhagen, again, a multi-country, multi-center study, low GI, high protein diet compared to higher GI, lower protein diet with higher and lower exercise levels. So the hypothesis was that in the Diogenes trial, it had been shown that the low GI, high protein, high exercise group gave the best weight maintenance at 6 months, and that this should therefore be applicable to those with prediabetes. Well, at the end of 3 years, the weight maintenance in the 4 different groups was between 4.6 to 4.9 kilograms, which is a very good weight maintenance after 3 years, with, I should say, diminishing interaction with the research teams as time went on. So despite that, there was a good outcome. Only 62 out of the 962 who stayed in the whole program developed diabetes by 3 years. That's 6.4%. And therefore, at 3 years, you can say that fewer participants have developed diabetes in the preview trial than in, say, the Finnish Diabetes Prevention Program or the US Diabetes Prevention Program, where the weight losses were slightly less. And we all know, and it's been published and known for a long time, that the amount of weight loss determines the proportion of people who will not develop diabetes. So to summarize, against the background globally of rising prevalence of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, total diet replacement offers a potential additional intervention to bridge the gap, particularly between conventional diet, which rarely can deliver 10 to 15 kilograms, although it can just occasionally, and the much larger weight losses that are achieved with bariatric surgery. So it fills that gap as a therapeutic opportunity. It delivers fast weight loss, 1.3 to 1.5 kilograms per week, and this is seems to be highly motivating. It can be delivered in a number of different settings. Compliance is high, and the safety profile is good. Kelly Johnson's going to talk about the safety profile at the end of the meeting. It can also reduce medication costs, and there are some published health economics papers relating to the direct trial and to some of the other trials. With that, to conclude then, but of course, just to add that, of course, this type of intervention doesn't just apply to diabetes. It can be applied to other comorbidities, osteoarthritis, obstructive sleep apnea, and so on. So that's my summary. And I'm going to suggest that we move on immediately to the next presentation, which is for George Tham from the Human Nutrition section of the University of Glasgow to talk to us about physiological and behavioural factors involved in weight loss maintenance. George is a dietitian by original training, has worked on a direct trial, is now a postdoctoral fellow working on other ongoing clinical trials. George, thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony, and thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak on these interesting topics. I'm going to do my best to squeeze as much as I can into 20 minutes. So I'll talk about some of the key research in this area and also some of the research I've done as part of my PhD. So here are my disclosures. I received funding from Cambridge Weight Plan for my PhD, and I also work on the direct trial. Sorry, I'm just getting to grips here with the slide transitions. So to start with some background here, Tony's presented some rather more promising findings from recent trials, the direct study and the diadem trial. But this slide here and decades of research really has shown that we're very able to help people to lose weight, but the real struggle lies in helping people to maintain weight losses over time. And what you can see from this slide is that people on a low energy diet were able to lose 15% body weight over a 10-week period. But over a 3-year period, 2 to 3, two-thirds of that weight loss was regained. And the nature of the dietary intervention here is not the point. The point here is that regardless of dietary intervention, this is the pattern that's typically followed when people after people have lost weight. And I want to draw the distinction here between weight regain after successful weight loss and average adult weight gain, which is somewhere between 0.3 kilos and half a kilo per year. So there's something different going on when people have lost weight intentionally with a diet versus primary weight gain in the development of obesity. So the question then becomes really is, why is preventing weight regain so difficult? Now, we talk about weight loss maintenance, but really it's probably more of an academic construct than anything else. It's really about how do we limit the regain of weight after successful weight loss. And this was something that I investigated from different perspectives during my PhD. I think it's important to acknowledge before I start talking about the sort of physiological and behavioural factors is that body mass index and obesity and thinness is very strongly influenced by genetics, and it's really true to say that obesity is unlikely to develop in an environment with a limited calorie availability. So in the current obesogenic environment, human beings have evolved to cope with food scarcity, and we're not quite so well served when it comes to dealing with an abundance of food. So it's really the interaction between our genes and our environment that explains the global rise in obesity. And it's this that we need to keep in mind, and how these factors influence with the changes in physiology that occur with weight loss and how this impacts on our behavior. So it's a whole interacting picture. And I think George Bray called it about right when he said that genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. So in terms of the physiological regulation of energy balance, what we know is that there's dozens of hormones regulating appetite. And these are received from the periphery, from the gastrointestinal tract, and from adipose tissue. And they're processed within the brain and translated into feelings of hunger and satiety. And in people with obesity, when they're compared with people of a healthy weight, they display what we might say is a dysregulated gut hormone response. So what I mean by that is satiety hormones, so telling the brain that you're feeling full, such as PYY and GLP-1, are reduced in the fasting and post-meal state in people with obesity. And the hunger stimulating hormone ghrelin, there's a reduced suppression of that after meals in people with obesity also when compared to people of a healthy weight. So this has clear implications here for eating behavior. We also know that in people with obesity, they display a greater activation of areas of the brain related to pleasure and reward in response to high calorie food cues, and reduced activation of areas of the brain relating to restraint and control. So when you think about the environment that we currently live in, where we really have ever-present opportunities to eat, this has serious implications for managing body weight. And we need to look at things in this regard and have more understanding towards the difficulties that some people will have in managing their weight in current conditions. So what happens when we put people on a diet? Well, this is a landmark study from the Prohito group in Australia, which shows that after a 13.5% body weight loss, the hunger stimulating hormone ghrelin goes up over time, and satiety hormones go down over time. And these are both in the fasting state and postprandially. And when people were asked about how hungry they felt or their desire to eat, these sensations, so hunger was increased after weight loss, and this was sustained over time, and the desire to eat also was increased from baseline values and sustained over time. And this really gives pause for thought in terms of, you know, how we perceive the voluntary control of food intake. So the next question becomes then, well, what happens if you can change the background physiology with a drug? So this is data from the semaglutide trial, which was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, semaglutide is a GLP-1 analog, so something that helps to reduce appetite. And this was a randomized controlled trial where both groups received a lifestyle intervention, but one group received placebo and the other group received the semaglutide. Neither group knew what they were receiving. And you can see clear marked differences in weight loss. So in the placebo group, the weight losses were 2.5% body weight versus 15% in the group who received semaglutide. So if you can change the background physiology, you can change appetite and you can change behavior. Let's be clear on this. People who receive semaglutide don't become better at meal planning and calorie counting. They're able to change their behavior as a result of reduced appetite. And just to further expand on these findings, which are potentially a game changer in obesity treatment, more than a third of people lost more than 20% of body weight. More than half of people lost 15% body weight or more. So we need to await longer term results. It's quite clear that if this drug is stopped at this point, people will regain weight. So we need safety data showing that these drugs are tolerable over the long term. On the other side of the energy balance equation, we can think about changes in energy expenditure. So how many calories people are burning. So this was another really elegant study, 25 years old now, by the Libel group from the Rockefeller in New York. And what they showed was, in really very tightly regulated conditions, was that when people lose 10% body weight, their energy expenditure reduces by around 15% more than what you would predict for the change in body weight. So we know for sure, and have done for a long time, that when somebody loses weight, their metabolic requirements go down just as a function of reduced body mass. That's common sense. So for example, a bigger person requires more calories to maintain their weight than a smaller person. What we're talking about here is a reduction in metabolism above and beyond what you would expect for the change in metabolic mass. Now, a key point to say here is that this adaptation does not seem to worsen with greater weight loss. So this has invoked weight loss of 10%, and it doesn't seem to get worse when you lose more weight. It's important to say here, with as most people will be aware, with in the field of obesity and nutrition, there's controversy. So not everybody agrees with this perspective. There are differences in methodologies used and differences in perspectives. But it's quite clear to my mind, based on looking at the sum of the data, is that this is an impediment to long-term weight loss maintenance. And another trial speaking to this was the Biggest Loser study, led by Kevin Hall's group, and it was front page news on the New York Times. And what basically it was saying was that the reduction in metabolic rate beyond what you would expect persists for several years after the weight loss, and even in the context of weight regain. So to summarize, some of the key physiological points here. Diet-induced weight loss activates compensatory changes in biological mechanisms that favor weight regain. And so what I mean by this is we have an increase in hormones regulating hunger, and a reduction in hormones promoting satiety. And also reductions in energy expenditure beyond what we would expect for the change in body weight. Now, this is not to say all hope is lost here. We're not just a bag of genes and physiology, and we have no control over our own behavior. This is what differentiates humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. So when we look at the Foresight report and the diagram that they produced, which showed over 100 variables affecting energy balance, there are many targets for lifestyle modification at the individual level and for altering thinking patterns and so forth, so that we can direct our thoughts and our motives towards changes in eating behaviours. When we think about some of the behavioural interventions we can use in this regard, and what are the most effective ways to do this, it's actually been known for an awful long time that very low energy diets are associated with better initial weight losses and better long-term weight loss maintenance. And this is a systematic review from 2001. And the figure here, you can see the line at the top is people who went on to very low calorie diets, so diets of 800 calories or less. And the average weight loss at 1 year is around 17 kilos, and the maintained weight loss at 5 years around 7 kilos. And this is contrasted with a weight loss of an average of 6 kilos and a maintenance of around 2 kilos in people who are going on to what you might call more sort of healthy, moderate energy restricted balanced diets. So this has been known for an awful long time, and that's possibly contrary to popular opinion. Why does this happen? Well, Tony's touched on it already. We've often found that when people who are on total diet replacement programs, certainly, is that they don't feel hungry. So part of this may be mediated by physiological factors, so that the rise in ghrelin is not so pronounced, and that we think is due to ketosis, which occurs when restricting carbohydrate and energy intake. So you're able to increase the energy deficit without increasing hunger. Of course, that's a very good thing when you're trying to support people in losing weight. It also obviously facilitates portion control compared to food-based diets. So people don't need to count calories, they don't need to plan food, they don't need to cook and prepare and do all of these things that make losing weight challenging. And it's convenient. So people have busy lives, and you know, for some people, meal replacements are a very helpful way to lose weight. The other thing is that people, relatively speaking, experience faster rates of weight loss, which is a rapid reward for behavior change compared to more modest energy restricted diets. So we know that people find it very disheartening when they feel like they're making a lot of changes to their diet, they're exercising a lot more, they get on the scales and they lose half a pound or something like that, and it can be demoralizing, and people often give up for that reason. In terms of academic research, we tend to present data as averages, and this conceals a lot of the individual variability that we see. This is an unpublished figure from the DIRECT trial, which shows both the controls and the interventions, the weight losses for each individual. So each dot, each circle indicates one person. And when we look at the intervention group, yeah, the mean weight loss was 10 kilos, but this actually represents very few people. What you can see, of course, is that there's some people that don't do quite so well as that. And you also have a significant proportion of people losing somewhere between 10 and 20 kilos. So I think it's always really important to keep in mind the individual variation when we talk about mean outcomes. When we think about who did best, then it appears that men seem to do relatively better than females when using a total diet replacement led program. And this was at both 12 and 24 months. Men had significantly higher rates of remission, and this was explained by greater weight losses. People who have higher anxiety and depression scores tend to lose less weight, and we know, of course, that engaging with lifestyle change programs is more difficult when life is more difficult. And again, as Tony alluded to earlier on, early weight loss is a strong and robust predictor of long-term weight loss maintenance. And we found that weight losses within the first 4 weeks of DIRECT were strong predictors of remission at 12 and 24 months, which of course is all driven by weight change. But overall, we lack good pre-treatment predictors that can assist us in identifying people who are most likely to succeed or not succeed. In terms of what's the best approach to weight loss maintenance? Well, we know that diet is king when it comes to weight loss, but in terms of weight loss maintenance, the queen, perhaps, as you might say, in terms of exercise, makes a good union with the diet component, because we know, it's well known that a combination of diet and physical activity is the most effective way to maintain weight loss in the long term, and exercise has become a strong and robust predictor of weight loss maintenance. Now, if the effects of exercise were driven entirely by increasing energy expenditure, it would be easy to understand, but we think that exercise also has beneficial effects on reducing hormones such as ghrelin, which stimulate appetite, as I said earlier, and in terms of increasing satiety peptides. We also know that extending support is also associated with a reduction in weight regain. So when you think about the direct trial and the diadem trials, they've taken really what's been known about weight loss and weight loss maintenance and put them together into interventions. So you could say that at the current time, state-of-the-art weight loss maintenance is rapid early weight loss, extended support with an emphasis on physical activity. And I just briefly want to just highlight some of the differences between direct and diadem. I think it's interesting to see that diadem had 12 kilogram weight loss at 12 months versus the average of 10 kilograms in direct. We don't know the long-term data. We'll await the 2-year outcome data from that trial. But to speculate on some of the reasons why that might be, I think that it's interesting to see that 70% of the population were male in the diadem trial. They had an extended food reintroduction period after the total diet replacement, so that ran for 3 months. So there was longer on a partial meal replacement plan, and there was initial emphasis on a lower carbohydrate approach during food reintroduction. And it might be that these combinations of factors may induce better weight loss maintenance, but we have to wait and see. In direct, we recognize that weight regain would occur, and we built in what we called rescue plans. So that meant that when people regained a certain amount of weight, they could go back onto total diet replacement or food reintroduction. And my colleague Naomi Brosnahan published a paper recently which shows that for a proportion of people, this is very helpful in terms of losing small amounts of weight that's been regained. In terms of weight loss maintenance, I think it's really quite clear from all of the data that there's no one-size-fits-all approach here. There's lots of debates about the most effective dietary intervention, but I think for a long-term lifestyle change, it's about tailoring things to the individual. Most people know what they should or shouldn't be doing. In terms of actually putting that into practice, that doesn't always happen, and we need to think really about how we improve intervention adherence. We can do this by delving into the psychological literature, so a systematic review investigating theoretical explanations for behaviour change maintenance found 5 overarching themes which are important. So I've listed them all there. I won't go through them all, but essentially, if people are satisfied with the outcomes they achieved, if they enjoy what they do, if they're able to self-regulate behavior and develop strategies to cope with barriers, if they're able to develop routines that become more habitual over time, they're more likely to maintain their behaviors. Another crucial aspect here is about having plentiful psychological resources. So being able to cope with stress and being able to cope with life difficulties is important. And of course, we know that having a supportive environment also is crucial. A really useful systematic review. It also gives us some indication of how to improve adherence, because when we talk to people about what works for them and what doesn't, we get the lived experience. So our outcomes in, for example, in direct, we present mean outcomes. It doesn't tell us how people changed and how they managed to do it. And the key theme that came out of this, this systematic review of weight loss maintenance related qualitative research was that making behaviour changes required for weight loss maintenance generates a psychological tension due to the need to override existing habits and the incompatibility of new behaviours with the fulfilment of psychological needs. Now, what this says to me is that there is a conflict between eating enjoyment and flexibility and the goal of weight control. So you better make sure that what you're doing in the long term is something that you enjoy. I conducted a qualitative research study as part of my my PhD, and what we found briefly was, on average, at 6 months, people lost 15% body weight, and about 9% weight loss was maintained out to 2 years. Now, there was no single experience that was common to everyone, but two key things came through to me. One was that after weight loss at around, the 6-month mark, people underestimated the potential for future weight regain, and they overestimated their ability to cope with future difficulties when they're highly motivated at a point of major weight loss. So people find it difficult to anticipate future barriers, and this, I think, seems to get in the way of coping planning. The thing is that the other thing was that the potential for regain remained over time, and this is mainly as a result of emotion-triggered eating to alleviate stress and negative mood. And I think we haven't quite got into focus just yet within behaviour change interventions, this need to address the emotional drivers that overwhelm dietary restraint in periods of stress and low mood. So in terms of strategies that we can use to counter some of the physiological responses to weight loss that I described, I think first and foremost, people with obesity need to be better informed of the challenges of weight loss maintenance. I think people generally grasp that, but actually it's but understanding the biological mechanisms that are promoting weight regain. If people understand this, they may be more likely to engage with some of the advice that comes alongside that. So if we are able to focus on low energy dense foods like the meal shown in this picture here, we're able to increase meal size and reduce hunger and energy intake by focusing on foods that are low in calories. So vegetables and fruits and whole grains and legumes, these types of things, we eat with our eyes. So, this looks like a big portion of food, but actually for very good bang for your buck in terms of calories, you might say. We know that higher protein meals are more satiating, and a higher protein diet helps to attenuate postprandial rises in ghrelin, and by upregulating satiety hormones such as GLP-1 and PYY, so to enhance fullness. Physical activity, as I mentioned, also has effects far beyond the energy expenditure components. So it also helps to acutely suppress the hunger stimulating ghrelin and increases GLP-1 and PYY without compensatory eating. Mentioned the gut hormone therapy. I think that's really where treatment has to go in the long term. For long-term weight loss maintenance, we can help people to lose weight with formula diets, for example, but I think that we're still going to need help in the longer term for maintenance. And in addition to that, what I previously mentioned was about interventions being better at addressing the emotional drivers of weight regain. So to summarize, there's no single mechanism which explains weight loss maintenance, but increases in appetite and adaptive reductions in energy expenditure may undermine the self-regulation of eating and the efforts to prevent weight regain. Diet and lifestyle behaviour fluctuate in response to life, and this is normal. Weight regain is normal, and I think we need to convey these messages sensitively to people with obesity so that we reduce shame concerning weight regain, and we leave the door open for people to remain engaged in treatment. And this type of attitude is going to help to facilitate coping planning and to prepare people in order to better maximise weight loss maintenance. I've mentioned a couple of times regarding interventions with greater emphasis on developing the skills to address emotional eating, and this may require training for healthcare professionals and counsellors. And I think my final thought is concerning a question really, is behavioural maintenance actually realistic for most people? The data would suggest otherwise. And this is just a speculative point really. I think that most of the things that we do in life, we do in phases. So there's very few things that we start and we maintain for life. And I think in many ways, weight management is a little bit like that. So I think we need to maximize the potential for weight loss when people are interested and motivated to do that, and seek to minimize weight regain when it's not people's main focus, but keep that door open to return and to re-engage and to retry. And with that, I thank you for listening. I apologize for going slightly over.
No, don't worry, George. Thank you very much. That was a very rapid, very thorough review. That was great. Thank you. I've noticed there are one or two questions that have come up. We will take those a little bit later on, and we'll move on immediately. If you move on to the next slide, George. And then we now come to the first part of the talks about myths. Kelly Johnson, who's going to speak first, is the visiting senior lecturer at King's College London. Actively therefore involved in research, but also head of nutrition research at Lighter Life Limited, with responsibilities for working with stakeholders in the food and health area, particularly in relation to people with overweight and obesity. Kelly.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes, thank you.
Good. Okay, sorry, I lost remote control there for a second. Okay, thank you very much, Tony and George, for those really interesting talks. What I'm going to do now, or for the next half an hour, what myself and my colleague Mark are going to do is we're going to actually delve down into the very specific myths which are pervasive. They're still widely promulgated. The idea for this seminar came about because of some press attention that was given to actually the big NHS trial that's being rolled out currently. And I remember looking at social media and looking in the newspapers and looking at opinions of consumers and healthcare practitioners, and there's just still so much in the way of myths surrounding the use of TDR. So I'm going to talk about, specifically today, I'm going to focus on the issue of weight maintenance. Obviously, George has given us a good background into that, but I'll give some particulars of some of the studies. Attrition is about how easy you find something. If you don't find it easy, do you stick with it? And then also to touch on adverse events as well. So these are my oh, sorry, hang on. That was my last slide. I've summarized what I'm going to talk about. Obesity treatment in the media is a really brief introduction here, because actually, when you think about consumers, they are presented with so much information. It's a wonder that anybody knows what's going on, which means they then need to seek care from healthcare practitioners. And of course, if they also don't have the correct advice, we're all in a bit of a pickle, really, aren't we? So yeah, I'm going to talk about weight maintenance and acceptability in the context of the information that is available currently. These are my disclosures. I'm head of the research section at Lighter Life UK Limited, currently a visiting senior lecturer at King's, and I'm also a member of a science committee of TDMR Europe. So this first slide, it's just a visual. I like to always throw up a visual at the beginning of talks like this, and I think it's an interesting thing to do, because I think nowadays there's a common presumption that our ancestors must have been these supremely healthy specimens leading exemplary lifestyles, and that somehow this problem of obesity is a recent phenomenon. And granted, we live in a cornucopia of calorie-laden food and drink society, but obesity was already a fact of life for Paleolithic man, or at least for Paleolithic women, as this figure clearly shows. It is 35,000 years old. It is the oldest known representation of obesity. Prior to this, the oldest known one was 25,000 years old, and then this one was found in 2009. And there's a very interesting article reference at the bottom if you wanted to read some of the history behind this. But the point I'm making showing this image is that obesity has been around for a very long time, and we know from the past that it's the potential for any one person to become obese isn't new, but the development of obesity on the current global scale that we're experiencing is absolutely a new challenge for us all. So when we're presented with new challenges, of course, plenty of people are there to provide us with new solutions or new suggested solutions. And I did this a Google search, and I went online and I typed up various terms that you might look to, fat loss, weight loss, fast weight loss, etc. And tens of thousands of searches were returned. Now, I'm not focusing on any one of these specifically. I mean, obviously, eating smaller portions would be a good idea, clearly, or eating better portions, perhaps. Text messaging to help you. I don't know if some of this stuff probably have some good evidence, some doesn't. Point being is I understand this, and I would be able to discern good from bad. The average consumer wouldn't. They then pick something that suits them, that they think is good. It may or may not be evidenced. They might be flummoxed by the information. They have conversations, and so anecdote is then presented as evidence amongst themselves, and that's kind of what you expect. You ask your friend about a diet, that we can live with that to some extent. What we don't want is where we have healthcare practitioners and individuals in a position to help people to be promulgating these myths and these unevident statements about various weight loss plans. So This is a paper that was published in The Lancet in 2013, and this is by Kazazza et al. And it's an interesting paper because they simply say what I've just said, in that there are so many myths, facts and presumptions about obesity. Just to be clear, a myth is something that persists in spite of evidence to the contrary. So it means that people still say something as fact when actually we have evidence that shows it's not. I'm not going to go through every single one of their already identified myths in this table, but the one that specifically affects total diet replacement programs is this one, which says that large rapid weight loss is associated with poorer long-term weight outcomes than slow gradual weight loss. I think everybody attending this seminar will have maybe even thought that at one point, and if you haven't thought it, you've certainly heard it. It is one of the most pervasive myths that we have when it comes to weight loss, the notion that slower is apparently better. We believe that, you know, the basis of the conjecture for this is from the very nutritionally insufficient, very first versions of very low calorie diets, total diet replacements, as they were back in the 60s. They are nothing like the diets today. To compare them is to compare chalk and cheese. Of course, consuming those diets at that time did lead to adverse effects, which means they were not suggested as being a healthy way to lose weight. And this belief has persisted. It still persists. It's repeated in textbooks, recommendations from health authorities, and you know, you do get a lot of dietitians who still do believe this is being true. So you know, if you have a more discerning consumer who, for example, isn't sure if this advice is true or not, they might go to somewhere like the NHS website. You know, you would expect that you would be given accurate information from that. So should you lose weight fast? If you want, you know, nobody wants to lose weight slowly. The website here actually clearly says when you're trying to lose weight, it's tempting to want results as fast as possible. There's not one person who went on a diet that ever disagreed with that statement. What's interesting here is that their statements that they have on this same page, they clearly say losing weight fast is unlikely to help you keep the weight off, and it comes with health risks. And then at the very bottom, it says the most effective way to lose weight and keep it off is to lose it gradually. This is the NHS website. We've actually contacted them to ask them to change this because we can categorically say this is not evidence-based advice. It's simply inaccurate to make these statements. Again, I'm referring to weight loss with TDR specifically. When we're talking about rapid weight loss, we are talking about weight loss done with a total diet replacement plan, which is legislated, nutritionally complete, has a huge amount of safety data behind it. So when we think about some of the myths, weight loss maintenance is one of the biggest things. I think George has already said, and Tony, you know, losing the weight for a lot of people isn't particularly difficult if you find something that you can stick to. But actually keeping the weight off longer term, it's a whole research field in itself, and there's so much that we don't know about it. And what's the evidence for this? You know, I think the general understanding with a lot of people is if you lose your weight too quickly, you'll gain it back rapidly and then some. So this paper from Purcell et al., it was the first paper, George has shown the graph, I'm about to show it again, that actually questioned this. They actually said, you know, there's this dietary advice that talks about the rate of weight loss impacting the rate of regain, but there's no real substance to the claims that you should lose it more slowly. So they, of course, wanted to investigate this. And this was, the study they did was a two-phased, randomized, non-masked dietary intervention trial. Non-masked because obviously you can't blind a dietary child, people know what they're eating. So the first phase was weight loss. So participants were randomized to either a 12-week rapid weight loss group or a 36-week gradual weight loss group. And the goal was to achieve 15% weight loss. Those individuals that met the goal of a minimum of 12.5% of their body weight as loss were then put through to the weight maintenance diet. So the rapid weight loss was achieved using a very low energy diet. By definition, a very low energy diet is something that is between 400 to 50 to 800 calories per day. They will have been up at the higher end of that. And the goal was to lose 1.5 kilos per week. The gradual group, they were aiming to lose a third of that amount. So then it follows that, well, it doesn't really follow because weight loss isn't linear, but the weight loss period was made 3 times as longer. One point which I think is very important here is that people would assume that if you're in the rapid weight loss group, you have all your food provided for you. So that would ensure that your participants were more willing to stick with it because they weren't paying. So to mitigate that, the gradual group were given several meal replacement products per day as well. So they were given the same amount of free food. So once participants had reached their weight loss goal, minimum of 12.5%, they were put onto the weight maintenance phase, which is where they followed an individualized diet. It was targeted to them for weight maintenance. They had individual sessions with the dietitian at weeks 4 and 12, and then every 3 months thereafter for the remaining 3 years, just under 3 years. And the primary outcome for this study was looking at the weight loss maintained. So that was the difference of the weight regained between when they entered the maintenance phase and the end of the maintenance period. So what are the findings from this? So as you can see, the grey part of the graph is just simply showing you that everybody lost their weight during the weight loss phase and they embarked on the weight maintenance phase. Interestingly, with this particular study, we saw that there were more individuals that withdrew from the gradual phase than there were from the rapid phase, 3 times as many because of citing difficulties with adhering to the diet. Of those who completed the weight loss phase, 81% of the rapid weight loss participants achieved their goal of 12.5% or more, compared with 62% in the gradual weight loss group. So when we look at this over time, we can see weight regain is a problem. George has already addressed that. This study isn't to talk about the amount of regain here. It's simply telling you about the difference between the 2 weight loss methods. And what you can see at 3 years, so 3 years post-diet, there is no difference between the weight regain in the rapid and the gradual group. It is simply, I think it was a 0.1 kilo difference. That was simply the difference. It was negligible. So clearly, there's no significant difference here between the groups, and I always like to quote authors directly on my slides. You know, the authors clearly say these findings are not consistent with dietary guidelines, which recommend more gradual weight loss in order to avoid disproportionate regain. There's no basis for this whatsoever. There's no reason to not lose your weight quicker because you are not more likely to regain it. So moving on to a more recent study, this is done by Neris Asprey, who works with Susan Jebb in Oxford, and this was the Droplet trial. Doctor referral of overweight people to low energy diet, total diet replacement treatment plan. And this, it's assessing the effectiveness and the safety of TDR programs for the routine treatment of obesity in primary care, which Tony's already described. I don't need to go into more detail. Again, this is an open label study. People know what they're eating. The TDR program was comprised of weekly behavioural support. This is key with this. In the more recent studies that you see with TDR interventions, it's widely recognised that it has to be the TDR and the behavioural support. You don't do one without the other. You simply won't be as effective without that behavioural support. So for 12 weeks, there was behavioural support provided, then monthly support for 3 months. The formula products provided circa 800 calories a day for the first 8 weeks when food was reintroduced. So the control group to this, i.e. the usual care group, was behavioural support for weight loss from a practice nurse. And it's a diet program essentially with modest energy restriction. I believe on this particular study there was 280 adults, circa 280, and they were randomized to the groups individually, and then they were measured at 12 months. So the primary outcome was change in body weight, and also metabolic measures of cardiovascular risk and health were assessed as well. So what we can see here is the total diet replacement graph. You can see that obviously the weight loss, as you would expect, was more rapid than it was with usual care. You can see that at the point where food reintroduction is starting to take place, it does start to taper off. It continues to go down because you're still in calorie deficit, and then it stops. And then there is that slight regain that occurs. When you look at the difference between the 2 groups, you can see at 1 year there's minus 10 individuals in the TDR group are 10.7 kilos down from their baseline weight, and individuals in the usual care group are just 3.1 kilos down from their baseline weight. And you know, the difference there is remarkable. It is, you know, it's a 7.2 kilo difference. In the 15% of the usual care group experienced weight losses of 10% or more, whereas 45% of participants in the TDR group experienced weight loss of 10% or more, and the TDR group showed significantly better improvements in metabolic markers, and there was no difference in adverse events between the 2 groups. So what the authors also made a point of noting is weight loss didn't vary by age, sex, SES status or diabetes status, which means that something like this can be readily implemented. And again, a quote from the paper: despite a common supposition that weight regain is related to the rate of weight loss, it's not supported by experimental evidence. So I think it's clear that weight management doesn't appear to be more problematic with rapid weight loss than with more gradual weight loss. Let's talk about attrition. A weight loss plan is only good if you can stick to it. I think we would all agree with that. Attrition simply refers to a person who's embarked on a weight loss plan and who's left it for whatever reason they might have. And this is a slide from Professor Falco-Schneehott. It was presented when the original direct data was presented for Diabetes UK 3 years ago. Questions were asked to respondents about their perceived effectiveness of weight loss methods. And what's really interesting on this whole graph, I'm just going to focus on The red bar is a VLCD or TDR in this context, and the commercial weight loss program. And there's very, very low acceptability of their effectiveness, despite the fact that there's currently good evidence behind both of those. Again, these are consumers. You might understand, based on what we've already said, why they might find, why they might believe that. So we want to know what healthcare practitioners think. There's a paper here in behavioural science published by Amanda Sainsbury's group, where they wanted to look at attitudes and approaches to the use of, they call them meal replacement products. Just to be clear, when you read the paper, they are talking about total dietary replacement, because meal replacements in Europe are slightly different. But what this group wanted to ascertain was, what's the attitude of healthcare practitioners towards the use of TDR? So they've distributed a survey and they've gauged some opinions. And the main findings was that whilst over 70% of healthcare practitioners had prescribed it currently or in the past, at that moment in time, only 7% of their patients were using this as a weight management treatment. 7%. Qualitative analysis showed that the potential barriers to these physicians prescribing this was their perceived experience of patient non-compliance and poor long-term weight loss durability. So we're talking about their belief that you will regain that weight back and more. There's the risk of weight cycling. They cited safety concerns with that, as well as its potential negative psychological impact. So if you think back to what you've heard Tony say and what you've heard George say, this is the complete opposite of what we know people experience when they embark on a TDR. What we also found quite pleasingly in this paper was that actually, if you've given these healthcare practitioners were formally educated around the benefits and had the information we're providing to you today, you would see an increase of prescription of 66% for patients who could really benefit from this. So education is key here, absolutely. So what are the current perceptions about TDRs being as difficult to follow? I won't elaborate on them. Nobody wants to feel any of these things. I mean, the biggest problem is feeling hungry quite often, isn't it? Nobody wants to feel hungry. You absolutely don't want your hair thinning or to develop any of the other problems. But what does the evidence base actually show about these adverse effects, I suppose, as being reasons for attrition on a TDR program? Well, this is another paper by Falco's group, and this was done by Lucia. And they were looking at the acceptability of a very low energy diet for type 2 diabetes remission in its counterbalance study, it's called. And really, they were looking to gauge patient experience and behavior regulation. So their objectives were to investigate participant experience with weight loss intervention using very low energy diets. What they found doesn't surprise any of us, but we report this because a lot of people don't know this. VLEDs were easier to follow than most people had anticipated. The fact that the rapid weight loss was taking place was a really big, important additional motivator for those people with type 2 diabetes, because people with type 2 diabetes do have a harder time losing weight. Behavior regulation strategies were key to being able to stick to this, and the social support that you gained from this made a big difference. So no one's saying you don't have to work at this, but it's simply not true that the attrition is higher from these. On this next slide, I won't talk too much about it. Again, these are patient perspectives. I just think read them, take it in. So much of what individuals who embark on this plan say is that having the choice of food removed from you makes it so much easier. If you don't have to think about what you're going to make or eat, it makes life easier. That's repeatedly reported by people at the coalface dealing with these patients. The rapid feeling of well-being, this is not anecdote. There's evidence that you feel better when you're in ketosis. Again, the Droplet paper quote, they say that many people are concerned that these will be unpopular and intolerable, but their results suggest otherwise. The Purcell paper actually noticed that the attrition in their study was significantly lower than in free living participants participating in other diet plans. So again, the attrition isn't a problem. In fact, we see what we think is probably better adherence. Finally, briefly, onto the adverse event. So an adverse event it refers to harm from a medical treatment per se rather than as an underlying event. And again, if we think back to that slide I just showed with all the potential side effects, what is the prevalence of adverse events in individuals who embark on a TDR? So this is actually Tony's slide. This is the data from the preview study. We don't have a comparator here because the TDR leg of this study was the weight loss part of the study was all TDR. What you can see is the adverse events that have the highest percentage of reporting are what we would call the mild events, and you can very easily remedy these with over-the-counter treatments, either increased fiber, take some paracetamol. They're very easily remedied. The more serious ones had an incredibly low prevalence and wasn't problematic. Back to the Droplet study, if you look at the Droplet study, overall adverse events were common and mild in both groups. 51% of participants in the TDR group versus 30% in the usual care group experienced at least one adverse event. But again, the most common adverse events were the mildest ones, which you can very easily manage. Only 11% in the TDR group and 12% in the usual care group reported a moderate or serious event. So the point being is there is no difference between TDR and usual care. So just to conclude, I've presented to you, I've cherry picked some studies, but the data is there. There's lots of studies that show very similar. Weight maintenance is absolutely achievable. Weight regain is not more likely after rapid weight loss. Weight regain will happen, but it's not more likely after rapid loss compared with gradual. Larger initial losses, we now know actually is associated with much better longer term outcomes. The attrition from TDR is not more pronounced. In fact, we've got reason to believe that with the proper support, adherence is better than conventional plans. And there is absolutely no significant noticeable difference in unmanageable adverse events between total diet replacement versus other plans. And again, behavioural change, sustained behavioural change is what is required to have that long-term weight loss maintenance as effective as possible. So thank you for your attention. I'm now going to hand over to Mark.
Thank you very much. And we'll move straight on. I'm watching the questions that are appearing, and we will try and answer those in just a moment. Thank you very much, Kelly. I started with a reference to Toronto, and we now move back to another Toronto link. Mark is a nutritionist who sits on our science committee. He studied in Toronto and has advised, lectured, and taught nutrition to healthcare professionals and others over the last 25 years. He's now going to very briefly look at the question of whether rapid weight loss has any influence on outcomes with regard to lean body mass. Mark, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Leeds. And thanks to all the presenters. I'm just going to look at one subject, so quite quickly here. And there's this other myth that's quite prevalent, and that is that somehow TDR, which is synonymous with rapid and substantial weight loss, causes disproportionately greater loss of lean body mass. Lean body mass being things other than fat in the body. It's also known as fat-free mass. There's a subtle difference between the two, but the aggregate amount is so similar. There's no reason to really go into the differences between the two. Just to get some disclosures out of the way, I'm head of nutrition for the 1-to-1 diet by Cambridge Weight Plan, and I'm also on the science subcommittee of TDMR Europe. So if we look at the prevailing question here, does the rapid weight loss with TDR cause a greater loss of LBM? I'm just going to look at studies comparing rapid versus moderate weight loss. So I'm going to look at exactly the kind of studies that compare these two situations. I'm going to look at other data on lean body mass losses. And I'm going to look at why some lean body mass loss may be actually desirable and even healthy. And that's something that isn't discussed too much. We just automatically think any loss of lean body mass is a disaster and it's going to lead to worse outcomes and recidivism, etc. And that's not necessarily true. And I'll tell you why near the end of my discussion. So first off, let's just look at why lean body mass is important. It's certainly important for healthy aging. People with higher lean body mass are more mobile. They avoid falls, and falls are one of the leading causes of death outside the big three in older people. It allows you more robust survivability, certainly in things like trauma injuries or things, but also things like cancer. Your survivability is likely to be longer and health better if you have more lean body mass. And lean body mass is also associated with a higher metabolic rate. Fatty tissue is generally fairly inert as far as metabolic rate. A lot of the metabolic activity is as a result of or occurs in those lean body mass tissues. But muscle is only one component of lean body mass. So we shouldn't get too confused about that. And I'll address that briefly at the end too. So broadly, and I'll look at some studies on all of these in a minute, but weight loss reduces both body fat and lean body mass in almost all cases. It does so in proportion to the degree of weight loss. And even usually when combined with exercise, if you're in a calorie deficit, you'll usually lose some lean body mass also, but not always. And we'll look at those studies also. And just to look at another intervention that causes weight loss, rapid weight loss, look at bariatric surgery very briefly on one slide. Okay, so someone may recognize this guy. I just thought I'd throw a little bit of humor in there. But so let's look at exercise first, because that puts everything in context. often thought of as the best, healthiest way to lose weight. And in some ways, maybe it is, but when used for weight loss, most exercise interventions actually do cause some lean body mass reductions also. And when combined with diet, exercise has a very small and often insignificant additive effect on the weight loss and on the reductions in lean body mass. So it often the effect's so small it can't be found. It's not significant statistically. And when we look at some of the big reviews on exercise, and some of the other slides earlier showed this, it's really remarkable to see that even when we look at supervised exercise programs, so they didn't just tell people to go away and exercise, they actually supervised them to make sure they did the exercise. And these studies are done over 12 weeks to over a year. We're only getting about 2 kilograms weight loss in these studies. So exercise is not a very rapid or certainly doesn't cause large decreases in weight. So now I looked at a systematic review of studies looking pretty much at exactly what we're looking at, but it's through diet in there. So we're looking at exercise with diet, or diet alone. And when they looked at all these studies, the exercise and diet both resulted in, and we're looking at subject groups here. So we're looking at placebo group versus the active group. There may be 2 active groups in the study. So the group that got the intervention, whether it was exercise or diet, over 75% of those subjects in those groups lost 0 to 40% of their fat-free mass when they're on a diet. So 0 to 40%, sorry, of the fat of the weight loss was fat-free mass. So when we look at diet, most of the diet studies showed 5 to 10 kilograms in weight loss. Those are typical diets, just calorie restrictive diets that you might get from your local surgery dietitian. And then exercise resulted in less than 5 kilogram weight loss in 94% of the studies. So the vast majority only showed this small weight loss. Now, of course, the advantage to exercise is that you lose less fat-free mass, and 15% of the studies in exercise, one of them being a resistance training study, showed increases in fat-free mass. And the resistance training is more likely to do that for obvious reasons, because weightlifting causes muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth. So now this graph is from the study, the Weinheimer study that I was just referring to. And if you look on the left column, it's just looking at changes in body weight near the top here. And if we look at the first, second, and third column, one is just energy restriction, so dieting. One's energy restriction plus exercise, second column. Third column is exercise alone. And it's quite conspicuous here that exercise doesn't cause any weight losses greater than 10 kilos, whereas quite a few, 20% or so of the dietary interventions do. And interestingly, the exercise plus diet don't show much better results than the diet alone. So there's some evidence of what I was saying just a minute earlier. So most of those as you can see, most of those exercise studies lost less than 5 kilograms. Now, with the good part, when you see the 2 arrows at the bottom, the 2 blue superimposed arrows, the opposite occurs in fat-free mass changes, the percent of fat-free mass change. So we've got 0 exercisers losing more than 5% of their body weight in these interventions, whereas again, about 20% of the dietary interventions, people did lose over 5% of their lean body mass or their fat-free mass. And again, and the opposite's true when we look at people that didn't lose any fat-free mass. So we can see here that the difference is probably because exercise results in such small amounts of weight loss. That's one of the reasons you don't see as much loss of fat-free mass, because weight loss is proportional to fat-free mass loss. So really quickly, just look at bariatric surgery, just because it's another intervention that can cause weight loss, and it's very rapid and it's very extreme. Just over a year after surgery, in one study, 25 to 33% of the weight loss was as lean body mass. And as the body mass losses got greater, as the increases, as the weight loss got greater, the proportion of that weight loss that was lean body mass also got greater. And then if you look at a systematic review and meta-analysis, the Haglehat study up to at least 35% of losses with bariatric surgery was lean body mass. So again, back to this question of whether the rapid weight loss with TDR causes more lean body mass loss. We're going to look at some studies that look exactly at that, rapid versus gradual weight loss. So the first one, this is by Seaman. It was done in 2019, so fairly recent, 101 obese postmenopausal women. And it looked at a 30% calorie restriction for 12 months, so moderate restriction, long amount of time, versus a 70%, much more aggressive restriction over a third of the time span, 4 months instead of a year, using TDR. The 70% was using TDR, and they found a twofold greater weight and fat loss, and only 1.5 times as much loss of whole body lean mass. Now, that wasn't statistically significant, so there might have been a trend there for a better ratio of fat loss to lean loss, but it wasn't statistically significant. And the really interesting thing about this study is there was no difference in muscle strength. And that's interesting because muscle strength is a better predictor of long-term health outcomes than is lean body mass. So that's a good thing for people that aren't losing strength or have a better prognosis. So if we look at another study here, female subjects, they looked at rapid weight gain, 1.9 kilos a week versus moderate, 1.1 kilos per week over 8 weeks. And the proportion of weight loss as fat-free mass was the main outcome. And when they looked at the proportion of fat-free mass of that weight loss, it was virtually identical. It was 0.42 versus 0.44, so no statistical difference there. If we look at yet another study, a small study, again, quite recent, 2018, Coutinho, 35 obese adults. They did TDR, quite a low calorie TDR by today's standards, 550 calories for 4 weeks versus 1,200 to 1,500 calories for 8 weeks. Both had significant and similar weight loss. They were both designed to create the same amount of weight loss, and they did, 9% weight loss. And fat mass and fat-free mass losses were similar, again. And in the rapid weight loss group, and this hasn't been shown in other studies that I could find, but it's interesting to see that they lost weight at a rate of 2.2 versus 1.2 kilograms per week. And sorry, the interesting one aspect of this that I was going to point out there, I got one line ahead of myself, is that after a 1 month maintenance phase after that weight loss, the rapid weight loss group significantly increased their fat-free mass, whereas the other group didn't, the gradual group didn't. Now, that hasn't been shown in other studies, but it'd be interesting to look at it in other studies. I'll see if there's something going on there. Another one, a 500 calorie deficit diet, so 500 calories subtracted from a maintenance level of calories. So that's a moderate restriction versus a 960 calorie TDR diet in 28 older adults with greater than 35. It was 35 to 45 BMI, so some of these people were quite big. And the total lean mass loss was not significantly different in groups again. So of all of the comparator studies I could find anywhere in the literature, they seem to disprove the idea that rapid substantial weight loss with TDR causes greater lean body mass losses. And now if we just look at this question of what is lean body mass, because we've got to look at first principles here. No, some people just don't think of that. They automatically assume any loss of lean body mass is undesirable, but maybe there's some good things about lean body mass loss. And if we think 40%, only 40% of your lean body mass is muscle. So there's 60% there that's bone, skin, other organs, water, plasma, blood, etc. And even in the case of lean body mass, which is slightly different from fat-free mass, some essential fat components to the cells are included also. So, and most of these organs, most of the major organs, are more metabolically active on a pound for pound basis than is muscle. So they're burning more calories pound for pound. And research a really thorough overview of body composition using three things: DEXA, dual X-ray absorptiometry, magnetic resonance imaging, and the 4-compartment model, which is the gold standard of seeing different components, different compartments of the body separating muscle from bone from other parts of the body, it said that it may be actually healthy for, it showed us actually 9.5 kilograms weight loss in this study, and several other of these organs shrank along with muscle. So it wasn't just muscle that atrophied and got smaller here. And it may be healthy for these organs to shrink. And the reason I say that is because we've got quite a bit of data now. We've had lots of calorie restriction data over the years showing that calorie restriction works in everything from yeast and fruit flies to primates, and almost certainly works in humans too. It's a highly conserved trait amongst all species, so we know it's ancient and important. And calorie restriction causes this process called autophagy. It's a funny word. All it means, it literally means eating yourself, but it's really just house cleaning for the cells, or a cellular recycling process. And if you impede this process, you cause problems for health and cellular function. And if you increase this process by things like fasting and calorie restriction, you can improve mitochondrial function and several other functions of the cell and cytosolic components. So there's the consensus is that's quite healthy now, and it's probably one of the major activities behind fasting and calorie restriction being beneficial for health and longevity. And if we look at what the authors of one of these autophagy studies said, they said the autophagy triggered by energy deficit leads to, quote, a cytoplasmic recycling process that counteracts the age-associated accumulation of damaged organelles and proteins as it improves the metabolic fitness of cells. So I'll leave you with that thought that maybe a little bit of lean body mass is desirable. And again, even if we look back at some of the really, really big studies on rapid weight loss, like the previous study that was mentioned on a couple of these slides before, over 2,000 people, and they again lost around 25% of their weight as lean body mass. So that's replicated in some of these very big studies and other studies that I didn't have time to get into today, though. So I'll leave you with those two thoughts, that rapid weight loss doesn't cause increased lean body mass loss, number one. And number two, that a little bit of lean body mass, and we don't know how much or how often, is probably desirable.
Okay, good, great. Thank you very much indeed. George and Kelly, could you put your microphones on, please? Because we now go just a very short period of time of addressing some of the questions. Excuse me, we've been answering some of them by typing responses. So, for example, there was a question earlier on about role of cortisol, and George, you made a comment on that. Do you want to just say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Not something that I've been involved in myself, and I'm not fully aware of the evidence, but I think it's safe to say that hormones acting in isolation are probably unlikely to have major effects. In terms of appetite regulation, it's really the combination of several hormones acting together that I think exert the effects. So cortisol on its own, not sure it would be having a major impact, but I get the point regarding stress. Yeah. And I think that probably working to manage stress effectively is as important, but I don't know that the research fully on that.
There's really interesting thing to think about cortisol is that it kind of tends to be high when insulin's low. So that would seem to be a good thing for body fat. But on the other hand, if you look at people with Cushing's syndrome, they have very high cortisol and they put on fat. They put on quite a bit of fat and they get overweight. And if you look at Addison's syndrome, which is another disease that has the opposite effect, causes low cortisol, people with Addison's lose weight rapidly and they're quite skinny. So the long-term data of high cortisol exposure seems to show that the more exposure over time, the fatter someone might be. But again, I would defer to what George said, that you can't blame any one hormone for weight gain or loss.
There's also a very good question from.
I was just saying we should also address the issue of emotional eating, because it isn't just hormonal. People are driven to eat emotionally as well, and that may, there's a hormonal role in there. And I think it's been made clear, certainly from George's presentation and other things that we've said. We don't just eat in response to our physiology. We eat in response to a whole bunch of different things. And how many times have people reached for a piece of chocolate or a drink or something in response to a stress? So I think a lot of it's behavioural, a lot of it's emotional, and yeah, it certainly just isn't down to one hormone.
There's also a question from Jan Vidic in Prague, who says, what about rapid weight loss in people who are overweight as opposed to obese? You started to respond to that, George, by saying that the lower limit for BMI in the direct trial was 27, but we don't have any specific trials of rapid weight loss with TDR in people who are only in the overweight group, do we yet? Although there is one, I think, in Newcastle going on.
Ongoing in Newcastle for people who've got diabetes and are sort of relatively normal weight. So that'll be interesting to see. Diabetes
related also, there's a question from Matt Caporn about medication use and stopping drugs before going on to the TDR program. Matt, the only way I can answer that is to say that guidance was provided by physicians who have been involved in trials on TDR. Not all the physicians who have done the trials were involved, and I think there may well have been different guidance from different physicians. Beyond that, I really can't say why they specifically made those recommendations about those drugs. We'd have to address.
I could add something to that.
Yeah.
It depends. It depends on what the goal is. But if the goal is diabetes remission, then obviously by definition that means off all anti-diabetes medications, HbA1c below 48. So that's one thing to say. Second thing to say is that when we stopped all anti-diabetes medications at baseline and direct, and we had very, very few adverse events.
The final comment, there was right at the very beginning a question about why 800 calories, why not another level? The answer to that is that these trials followed on from earlier trials which had used those levels, and also comparisons of very low energy intake with 800, finding the 800 worked perfectly. We can provide those sources to you because we know where the question came from. That was Elizabeth Beltran Lopez. We can send you an email with some references there. So we need to move on now to our summary. Thank you very much for all those questions. We will try and address the other ones by typing responses or sending emails. We need to move on now to the closing remarks. Kelly, thank you.
Okay, right, thank you. So really just to round it all up and to summarize everyone's talks, really just very specific points. So TDR gives fast weight loss, up to 1.5 kilos a week, very high compliance, very good safety profile, and there's a medication cost reduction here not to be ignored. It's proven in very high quality RCTs, with the evidence really gaining traction over the last few years to deliver amounts of weight loss needed to achieve diabetes remission. And there's a bunch of other benefits as well, other obesity comorbidities in a high proportion of users, as well as osteoarthritis and OSA. There's no one single mechanism that explains weight loss management. We get that, it's hugely complicated, but increases in appetite and adaptive reductions in energy expenditure may undermine the self-regulation of eating and efforts to prevent weight regain. And diet and lifestyle behavior fluctuate in response to life. Weight regain is normal. Conveying these messages can sensitively reduce the shame associated with it and help to facilitate planning to maximize your weight loss maintenance. We've got high quality evidence again that shows that subsequent weight maintenance is achievable. You're not more likely to regain after rapid weight loss using a TDR than you are if you lose it more gradually. Attrition from a TDR is not higher than conventional weight loss methods, and adherence can often be better in motivated individuals. And adverse events, they're manageable and they're not significantly more problematic whilst on a TDR compared with other plans. And finally, the loss of lean body mass occurs with virtually all diets, and that's regardless of the rapidity of which you lose weight and how much you lose. And it is proportional to total weight loss. The significant proportion of your lean body weight loss is from organs other than muscle. People often think it's muscle, it's not, it's other parts of the body. And as part of normal and healthy cellular recycling processes that accompany caloric restriction, and muscle quality and functionality is shown not to be compromised.
Tony, you're on mute.
You're on mute. Oh.
I apologize.
You're still on mute.
You just muted again.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. So thank you very much indeed, all of you, for your participation and the hard work in preparing your talks and delivering them. Thank you also to the Secretariat at the White House Consultancy who've organised the whole exercise. For those of you who asked questions, but with respect to whom we haven't had time to answer them, we will send you emails. Anybody who's interested in gaining more information, please write to us. Write to the Secretariat and we'll send you whatever materials you request. And so finally, thank you very much for joining us. This is really just the beginning of a process of helping to inform people about total diet replacement and hopefully enabling total diet replacement and meal replacements to be appropriately used as part of the offering in relation to managing Europe's major problems in relation to obesity and obesity-related comorbidities, particularly diabetes and pre-diabetes. So thank you very much for attending. Most grateful to the speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.